The police cruiser's red and blue lights painted David's driveway in harsh, strobing colors as his neighbor Karen stood on her manicured lawn, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction. He'd done everything the HOA demanded, removed the basketball hoop, repainted the fence, even relocated his garden gnomes to the exact specifications in their 17-page manual. But Karen wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. As Officer Martinez approached with his hand resting on his radio, David realized that following the rules had been his biggest mistake. Because when you're dealing with someone who's made destroying your life their full-time job, compliance isn't surrender, it's just the opening move in a game where the stakes are everything you've worked for, and the rules change every time. You think you're winning? David Richardson stood in his kitchen, watching the steam rise from his coffee mug as the morning sun filtered through his blinds. The suburban street outside looked peaceful enough, folk trees lining the sidewalk, freshly painted mailboxes standing at attention, lawns maintained with military precision. Maplewood Heights had been his dream neighborhood when he and Sarah bought their colonial-style house 3 years ago. Now, staring at the letter in his hand, it felt more like a battlefield. The HOA letterhead was crisp, official, and absolutely merciless. David read it for the third time, his jaw tightening. With each word, "Mr. Richardson, it has come to our attention that your property at 1247 Elm Street contains several violations of the Maplewood Heights community standards. You have 14 days to remedy the following issues or face escalating fines and potential legal action." The list was exhaustive. Basketball hoop positioned 3 inches too close to the street. Fence paint classified as colonial blue instead of the approved heritage navy. Garden gnomes exceeding the 2 decoration limit by exactly 1. Even his mailbox, the same mailbox that had been there when he bought the house, was apparently mounted at an inappropriate height. "Honey, you're going to burn a hole in that paper if you keep staring at it." Sarah's voice carried a hint of forced lightness as she entered the kitchen, already dressed for her shift at the hospital. "Look at this." David held up the letter. "They want me to move the basketball hoop because it's 36 inches from the street instead of 39. 3 inches, Sarah, 3 damn inches." Sarah frowned, reading over his shoulder. "Can they really do this? According to the CC&RS we signed when we bought the house, they can do whatever they want." I should have read the fine print more carefully. David set down his coffee harder than necessary. "But I know who's behind this." As if summoned by his words, a sharp knock echoed through the house. David peered through the front window and felt his stomach drop. Karen Whitmore stood on his porch, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Speak of the devil," David muttered. Karen Whitmore was the self-appointed guardian of Maplewood Heights, moral fiber. At 52 meant she had the bearing of a woman who'd never been told no, and the determination of someone who'd made other people's business her personal crusade. She'd moved in 2 doors down about 6 months ago, and within weeks, she'd somehow maneuvered herself onto the HOA board. Since then, the neighborhood had become her personal kingdom. David opened the door, forcing a smile. "Good morning, Karen." "David." Karen's voice was crisp, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. "I assume you received the compliance notice. Hard to miss something that thick." David held up the letter. 14 pages seems a bit excessive for a basketball hoop. Karen's smile was razor-sharp. "The rules exist for a reason. Property values don't maintain themselves." She glanced past him into the house. "Is Sarah home? I'd like to discuss this with both homeowners. She's getting ready for work." David stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Something about Karen's presence in his house felt like an invasion. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" "The letter seems pretty clear. I want to make sure you understand the seriousness of the situation." Karen consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "These violations have been ongoing for months. The basketball hoop alone has generated 17 complaints." 17 complaints. David's voice rose. "From who?" "Concerned residents who value the aesthetic integrity of our community." Karen's tone suggested she was speaking to a particularly slow child. "The hoop is visible from the street. It sends a message that we're the kind of neighborhood where people play ... games ... in their driveways." David stared at her. "You mean the kind of neighborhood where kids actually play outside? I mean the kind of neighborhood where property values plummet because people think they can turn their driveways into recreational facilities. Karen made a note on her clipboard. Speaking of which, I noticed your son was bouncing a ball quite late last night. The noise ordinance clearly states he was shooting hoops at 7 p.m. David's patience was wearing thin. Since when is 7 p.m. considered late, since it disrupts the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties? Karen's eyes narrowed. Some of us have evening routines that don't involve the constant thump-thump-thump of a basketball. David looked down the street. The Hendersons had a trampoline in their backyard. The Johnsons had a above-ground pool that was clearly visible from the street. Mrs. Chen had garden gnomes that made his 3 look like minimalist decor. What about the Hendersons' trampoline? David asked. Or the Johnsons' pool? Those items are positioned appropriately and don't violate any aesthetic guidelines. Karen's answer came too quickly to rehearse. Your basketball hoop, however, is mounted on a garage that faces the street. It's the first thing people see when they enter our neighborhood. It's the first thing people see when they enter my property, David corrected. My property that I pay taxes on. Karen's composure cracked slightly. Your property that exists within a community with standards. Standards that everyone agreed to follow when they chose to live here. Everyone except you, apparently. The words slipped out before David could stop them. The temperature between them dropped 20 degrees. Karen's smile became predatory. I'm not sure what you're implying, David, but I take my responsibilities to this community very seriously. She flipped through her clipboard with deliberate slowness. Perhaps we should discuss your fence. What about my fence? The color is wrong. Colonial blue isn't on the approved list. Karen produced a paint chip card from her clipboard. This is Heritage Navy. This is Colonial Blue. See the difference? David looked at the 2 paint chips. They were virtually identical, both dark blue, both conservative, both the kind of color that would blend into any suburban landscape. They look the same to me, he said. That's because you're not trained to notice these distinctions. Karen's voice carried the condescension of someone explaining advanced calculus to a preschooler. But I am. I have a degree in interior design. And I can tell you that the wrong color choice can impact property values by as much as 3%. 3% of what? Of the median home value in the neighborhood. Karen was warming to her subject now. We're talking about potentially thousands of dollars in lost equity because you chose the wrong shade of blue. David felt a headache building behind his eyes. Karen, with all due respect, I think you're overthinking this. Am I? Karen's voice sharpened. Then explain why 3 potential buyers have walked away from properties in this neighborhood in the past month. Explain why the Rodriguez's house has been on the market for 6 weeks, maybe because they're asking $20,000 over market value. Or maybe because buyers drive through the neighborhood and see basketball hoops and wrong-colored fences and garden gnomes. Scattered around like some kind of suburban yard sale, Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't just about rules, David. This is about maintaining the kind of community that people actually want to live in. The kind of community where kids can't play basketball in their own driveways. The kind of community where people respect their neighbors enough to follow the agreements they signed. Erin straightened up, her professional mask sliding back into place. You have 13 days remaining to address these violations. I strongly suggest you don't waste them. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and David, the next time you want to discuss HOA business, I'd prefer you speak to me with the respect that my position deserves. I'm not just your neighbor anymore. I'm your board member. David watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with military precision. Across the street, he noticed Mrs. Patterson peering through her curtains, 2 houses down. Mr. Chen was suddenly very interested in checking his mailbox. The whole neighborhood was watching. Sarah appeared beside him, car keys in hand. How bad was it? She's completely lost her mind, David said. She's treating this like some kind of personal vendetta. Maybe you should just move the basketball hoop, Sarah suggested gently. Pick your battles, you know. David looked at his house, their house, with its neat lawn and modest landscaping. The basketball hoop had been one of the first things he'd installed after they moved in. He'd imagined teaching his future kids to shoot free throws, hosting neighborhood games, building the kind of community connections that made suburbs feel like home. It's not about the BA. The HOA handbook was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach. 127 pages of single-spaced regulations covering everything from mailbox height to the acceptable angle of holiday decorations. David had spent the previous evening highlighting every single rule, cross-referencing subsections, and creating a comprehensive compliance checklist. If Karen wanted perfect adherence to community standards, she was going to get it. He started with the garden gnomes, according to Section 12.43 of the Landscape Guidelines. Decorative lawn ornaments shall not exceed to 2 in number per front yard area, shall be positioned no closer than 18 inches from property lines, and shall be constructed of materials consistent with the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. David had 3 gnomes. The third, one a cheerful fellow with a red hat that Sarah had bought at a garage sale, had to go, but the handbook didn't say anything about relocating decorations to the backyard. He moved the excess gnome to his back deck with ceremonial precision, measuring exactly 18 inches from his property line for the remaining 2. Then he pulled out a ruler and adjusted their positions to comply with the spacing requirements down to the quarter-inch. Next came the mailbox. According to Section 8.2.1, mailboxes must be mounted between 42 and 45 inches from ground level, measured from the bottom of the mailbox to the established grade. David's mailbox was 46 inches high. The hardware store clerk: "Sir, the Postal Service regulations allow for a range of 41 to 45 inches. The clerk said, "Your mailbox is probably fine where it is." "It's not about Postal Service regulations," David replied. "It's about HOA compliance, but 1 inch that's going to require redigging the post, resetting the concrete, ... I know." David purchased the necessary materials with grim determination. "I'll also need a surveyor's measuring tape. The standard hardware store variety isn't accurate enough." By 7 a.m., David had remounted his mailbox at exactly 44 inches from ground level, documented the height with photographs, and filed a compliance report with the HOA office. The report was submitted via certified mail with a return receipt. Requested Sarah found him in the garage, organizing his tools with military precision. "You're really doing this," she said. "It wasn't a question. I'm following the rules," David replied. "Every single one of them. This is about more than rules, isn't it?" David looked at his wife, her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, her hair pulled back in a tired ponytail, her eyes reflecting the strain of living in a neighborhood where their every move was scrutinized. "She wants to play games," he said finally. "Let's play games." At 8:15 a.m., David was back outside, this time with a laser level and a measuring tape. The basketball hoop was compliant, but the handbook also specified that recreational equipment must be stored in a manner that does not interfere with the visual continuity of the streetscape. David had overlooked this requirement. The basketball that his teenage nephew had left in the driveway was technically in violation. He moved the basketball to the garage, then consulted his handbook again. Section 15.7 covered vehicular storage requirements. Garages must be used primarily for the storage of resident vehicles. David measured his garage, exceeded the 15% threshold by approximately 3 square feet. The solution was simple. He would build a storage shed that met all HOA specifications for auxiliary structures. The permit application alone was 17 pages long. At 9 a.m., David was at the HOA office, which occupied a converted retail space in the strip mall outside their neighborhood. The office was sterile and efficient, with motivational posters about community pride and property values covering the walls. Margaret Chen, the HOA administrator, looked up from her desk with barely concealed wariness. She was a woman in her 40s who'd seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize the signs of an escalating conflict. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "how can I help you today?" "I'd like to submit a permit application for an auxiliary storage structure," David said, placing his meticulously completed forms on her desk. "I'd also like to file a compliance report documenting the corrections I've made to my property, and I need to schedule an inspection to verify that all violations have been addressed." Margaret glanced through the paperwork. "This is very thorough. I want to make sure I'm following all the guidelines exactly as written. Mr. Richardson, I have to ask, is this related to the complaints that have been filed about your property?"
What?
"Complaints? Well, there have been several reports submitted by board member Whitmore regarding various violations. ... double quotes. What kind of reports? Noise complaints, mostly. And some concerns about the timeline for addressing the initial violations. Margaret consulted her computer screen. What kind of noise complaints? Well, there was a report filed yesterday evening about power tools being used after 8 p.m., and another one this morning about construction activity before 7 a.m. David felt his blood pressure rising. I was adjusting my mailbox height. To comply with HOA regulations, the work took 15 minutes. Then I'll need a copy of the noise ordinance, David said. And I'll need to understand how homeowners are supposed to complete compliance work within the approved timeframes if they're not allowed to work during the hours when violations occur. Margaret looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Mr. Richardson, maybe you should speak directly with Mrs. Whitmore about these concerns, ... I've spoken with Mrs. Whitmore. She's made it clear that she expects full compliance with all HOA regulations. That's what I'm trying to provide. Perhaps there's a middle ground. Either the rules apply to everyone or they don't. Margaret printed out a copy of the noise ordinance and handed it to David. The storage shed permit will need to be reviewed by the architectural committee. That process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. How long do I have to address the garage? Storage violation. The original compliance letter gave you 14 days for all violations. Margaret's silence was answer enough. David smiled grimly. I'll need to speak with board member Whitmore about this conflict and the timelines. Could you schedule a meeting? I'll see what I can do. David left the HOA office with a thick folder of additional regulations and a growing sense that he'd stumbled into a bureaucratic maze, which, he suspected, was exactly the point. His phone rang as he was walking back to his car. The caller ID showed his neighbor, Tom Henderson. David, what the hell are you doing over there? Tom's voice was strained. Karen Whitmore just knocked on my door, asking if I'd heard construction noise from your house this morning. I was adjusting my mailbox height at 6 in the morning. It was 6:45, which is within the approved construction hours, according to the noise ordinance. Jesus, David, you're really going to war with this woman. I'm following the rules, she insists, are so important. The rules aren't the point, man. The point is that she's completely lost her mind, and you're giving her ammunition to make all our lives miserable. David stopped walking. What do you mean? I mean, she's been going door to door for the past week, asking neighbors to report any violations they see. She's got Mrs. Patterson writing down every time someone's trash can is visible from the street. She's got the Johnsons measuring their pool fence height. She's turning the whole neighborhood into a surveillance state because of me, because you're the first person who's ever stood up to her, and she's freaking out. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. David, she's filed 14 separate complaints about your property in the past 5 days. 14 she's documenting every time you mow your lawn, every time your nephew shoots hoops, every time Sarah pulls weeds in the garden. That's insane. Yeah. Well, welcome to life with Karen Whitmore as your personal HOA enforcement officer. Tom paused. Look, I know you're trying to prove a point, but maybe you should just give her what she wants and hope she finds someone else to harass. What she wants is for me to move out of the neighborhood. Then maybe you should consider it. David felt like he'd been punched. Tom, we've been neighbors for 3 years. We've had barbecues together. Our kids play together. You're telling me to move because one person has decided she doesn't like me? I'm telling you to pick your battles. This isn't a battle you can win. Watch me, David said, and hung up. He drove home in silence, his mind racing. If Karen wanted to document every aspect of his compliance efforts, he would give her something worth documenting. The rest of the day was spent in meticulous preparation. David researched HOA law, printed out relevant statutes, and created a comprehensive filing system for all his compliance documentation. He photographed every inch of. David spent the next morning at the county courthouse, armed with a legal pad and enough determination to move mountains. The records office was a maze of filing cabinets and fluorescent lighting, staffed by clerks who'd seen every kind of property dispute imaginable. I need to see the original HOA documents for Maplewood Heights, David told the clerk, a tired-looking woman with graying hair and the patience of someone who'd explained municipal law to thousands of confused homeowners. That would be the CC&R's bylaws and articles of incorporation, she said, pulling out a thick folder. Are you having a dispute with your association? You could say that. David spread the documents across a table and began reading. The original covenants, conditions, and restrictions for Maplewood Heights had been filed in 1987 when the neighborhood was first developed. They were comprehensive, detailed, and absolutely fascinating for someone looking for loopholes. What he found in Section 23.7 made his heart race. Any homeowner may petition for review of HOA board decisions by submitting a formal complaint to the Architectural Review Committee, provided said complaint is accompanied by supporting documentation and signatures from no fewer than 15% of the total homeowners in the development, 15% of the 127 homes in Maplewood Heights meant he needed 19 signatures. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was buried in the next paragraph. Upon receipt of a valid petition, the Architectural Review Committee shall conduct a comprehensive audit of all HOA enforcement actions taken within the preceding 12 months, with particular attention to consistency of application and adherence. To due process requirements, David read the passage 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. If he could get 19 neighbors to sign a petition, the HOA would be legally required to audit Karen's enforcement actions for the past year. Every complaint, every violation notice, every arbitrary interpretation of the rules would be scrutinized by an independent review committee. And given what Tom Henderson had told him about Karen's recent surveillance campaign, David suspected where he purchased poster board, markers, and a laminating machine. He opened it to find Mrs. Patterson from across the street holding a casserole dish and looking uncomfortable. "David, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said. "I brought you and Sarah some dinner. I know you've been busy with all the property improvements." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Patterson. Come in." Mrs. Patterson was 73 years old and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. She'd watched Maplewood Heights transform from a modest suburban development into the manicured community it was today, and she'd seen enough neighborhood politics to recognize a brewing war. "David," she said, settling into his living room chair, "I need to tell you something. About Karen Whitmore." "What about her?" "She's been asking me to document things. About your family." Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely above a whisper. "She wants me to write down every time I see your nephew playing basketball. Every time Sarah works in the garden. Every time you come home from work." David felt his stomach clench. "Have you been doing it?" "At first I thought she was just being thorough. Making sure everyone follows the same rules." Mrs. Patterson twisted her hands in her lap. "But then she started asking about other families too. The Hendersons, the Johnsons, the Chuns. She's got a whole network of people watching their neighbors. How many people? At least a dozen, maybe more." Mrs. Patterson looked ashamed. "David, I think she's building files on everyone in the neighborhood. Detailed records of everything we do. Because what she's doing isn't right. And because, Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "Because she offered to reduce my HOA fees if I keep detailed logs on your family." David stared at her. "She what?" "She said that families who help maintain community standards deserve consideration when it comes to fee assessments. She said that people who help with enforcement efforts shouldn't have to pay as much as people who create enforcement problems. She's bribing you to spy on us. She's bribing a lot of people." Mrs. Patterson's voice was shaking now. "David, I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. She's turning neighbor against neighbor." "Have you taken the deal?" "No, but some people have." Mrs. Patterson named 3 families, all of whom lived within sight of David's house. She's got them writing daily reports. David felt like he was living in a surveillance state. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to sign a petition?" "What kind of petition?" David explained the HOA audit process he'd discovered. "If I can get 19 signatures, we can force a review of all her enforcement actions. Every complaint, every violation notice, every deal she's made with neighbors." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up. "You mean we can stop this? We can expose it?" He documented every interaction he'd had with Karen, every violation notice he'd received, every arbitrary interpretation of the rules she'd imposed, and a detailed timeline of escalating harassment by evening. He had a comprehensive case that painted a picture of systematic abuse of HOA authority. Next morning, David began canvassing the neighborhood. His first stop was Tom Henderson. "Jesus, David," Tom said, reading through the petition. "You really think this is going to work?" I think people are tired of living in fear of their HOA board. Some people are. Others are benefiting from the current system. Tom lowered his voice. Did you know that Karen's been offering fee reductions to people who report violations? Mrs. Patterson told me. Are you taking the deal? Hell no. But the Rodriguezes are, and the Yamadas, and probably half a dozen others. Tom signed the petition with a flourish. Count me in. This has gone too far. The Johnsons were next. Maria Johnson listened to David's explanation, while her husband Miguel nodded grimly. She's been after us about our pool fence, Maria said. Claims it's 2 inches too low, even though it passed inspection when we installed it. She wants us to replace the entire fence, Miguel added. They signed without hesitation. The Chuns were more cautious. David found them working in their garden, tending to a collection of decorative plants. That would have made a botanical garden jealous. We don't want trouble, Mrs. Chen said carefully. We follow all the rules. That's exactly the problem, David replied. The rules keep changing depending on Karen's mood. Today, you're in compliance. Tomorrow, she might decide your garden violates some aesthetic guideline you've never heard of. Mr. Chen looked at his wife. They had a quick conversation in Mandarin, then turned back to David. We've heard about the surveillance, Mr. Chen said quietly. Neighbors watching neighbors, reporting everything to Karen Whitmore. This is not the kind of community we want to live in. They signed. By noon, David had 12 signatures. By evening, he had 17. He needed 2 more. The problem was that the remaining homeowners were either part of Karen's surveillance network or too intimidated to take a stand. David was beginning to think he'd have to abandon the petition when Sarah came home with unexpected news. I ran into the new family, she said. The Parkinsons, in the house where the Rodriguezes used to live. They seem nice. Have they met Karen? She's already sent them a violation notice. Something about their moving truck being parked on the street for more than 24 hours. David grabbed his petition and walked 3 blocks to the Parkinson house. James Parkinson was a software engineer in his 30s, and his wife Alina was a teacher. They had 2 young children and the shell-shocked expression of people who'd just discovered they'd moved into a neighborhood ruled by a tyrant. 18 violations, James said, reading from a letter that looked disturbingly familiar. 18 separate violations for the crime of moving into our own house. What kind of violations? David asked, moving boxes visible through windows. Alina read from the list. Temporary storage of household items on the front porch. Failure to immediately establish appropriate window treatments. And she wants us to buy. David showed them his petition. This is about more than individual violations. This is about someone who's using HOA authority to control every aspect of our lives. Where do we sign? Alina asked. David had his 19 signatures that night. He drove to a 24-hour copy center and prepared his formal submission. The petition was 37 pages long, including supporting documentation, neighbor statements, and a comp. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night. David jolted awake to the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the urgency of the late-night call made him answer. Mr. Richardson. The voice was young, nervous, official. This is Officer Chen with the Maplewood Police Department. We've received a report of suspicious activity at your residence. David sat up, instantly alert. What kind of suspicious activity? A neighbor reported seeing someone prowling around your property with what appeared to be tools or weapons. We're sending a unit to check it out. Officer, I'm in my house. My family is in the house. There's no one prowling around with weapons. Sir, we still need to investigate the report. Can you come outside and speak with the responding officer? David looked at the clock again. 2:17 in the morning. Sarah stirred beside him, mumbling something about the phone. Officer, who made this report? I can't release that information, sir, but we take all security concerns seriously. David pulled on clothes and went downstairs. Through the front window, he could see police car lights strobing red and blue across his lawn. 2 officers were walking around his property with flashlights, checking the bushes and examining his fence line. When he opened the front door, Officer Martinez looked up with an expression of weary recognition. Mr. Richardson, we meet again. Officer Martinez. Someone reported suspicious activity. Anonymous tip came in about 20 minutes ago. Caller said they saw someone with tools trying to break into your shed. David looked at his backyard storage shed, which was clearly visible and completely undisturbed. As you can see, there's no break-in, no damage, no signs of anyone being on my property. We can see that Martinez made notes on his clipboard, but we had to respond to the call. Who made the call? Anonymous tip came through the non-emergency line. David felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Officer, how many anonymous tips have you received about my property in the past month? Martinez consulted his notepad. This would be the 7th. 7 anonymous reports in 1 month. Various complaints, noise violations, suspicious activity, possible code violations, all anonymous, all requiring investigation. And have any of these anonymous reports ever turned out to be legitimate? Martinez was quiet for a moment. Mr. Richardson, between you and me, this seems like a neighbor dispute that's gotten out of hand. It's gotten out of hand because someone is using the police department as a harassment tool. If that's true, it's a serious problem. False reports waste resources, and Officer Martinez was interrupted by the sound of a door slamming. Across the street, Karen Whitmore emerged from her house wearing a bathrobe and an expression of theatrical concern. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called out, hurrying across the street. "I was so worried when I saw someone skulking around the Richardson property." Martinez looked between David and Karen. "Ma'am, did you make the anonymous report?" "I called as soon as I saw the suspicious activity. I didn't want to give my name because I was afraid of retaliation." "What exactly did you see?" Martinez asked. "A figure moving around the backyard with what looked like tools or possibly weapons. They were trying to get into the storage shed." David stared at her. "Karen, that's completely false. No one was on my property. No one was near my shed. I know what I saw. You know what you made up." Officer Martinez held up his hand. "Let's keep this civil, ma'am. From what window did you observe this activity?" Karen pointed to her upstairs bedroom window. "I was awakened by noise and looked out to see what was happening." Martinez examined the sightline from Karen's window to David's backyard. "Ma'am, that shed isn't visible from your bedroom window. There's a fence and several trees blocking the view." Karen's composure faltered slightly. "Well, the noise, drew my attention, and when I investigated—" "Ma'am, were you on Mr. Richardson's property?" "Of course not. I would never trespass." "Then how did you see someone at a shed that isn't visible from your house?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Karen looked between the officers and David, clearly realizing she'd been caught in a lie. "I may have been mistaken about the exact location," she said finally, "but I definitely heard suspicious noises." "What kind of noises?" Martinez asked, rattling, like someone trying to force open a lock. "Ma'am, it's 2:20 in the morning. You called in this report 20 minutes ago. That means you were awakened by suspicious noises at 2 a.m. "That's correct, Mr. Richardson. What were you doing at 2 a.m.? "Sleeping in my bed, officer, until you called." Martinez made more notes. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to think very carefully about what you actually observed tonight." Karen's mask of civic concern was slipping rapidly. "I know what I heard, but not what you saw. I saw enough to be concerned for the safety of the neighborhood." "You saw enough to file a false police report," David said. "It wasn't false. I reported suspicious activity, and you investigated. That's how the system is supposed to work. The system isn't supposed to work by having neighbors file fake emergency reports at 2 a.m. Officer Martinez stepped between them. "Mr. Richardson will be filing a report about tonight's call. If there's a pattern of false reports, the department will take appropriate action." "What kind of action?" "Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor. If someone is repeatedly making unfounded emergency calls, they can be charged." Karen went pale. "I wasn't making false reports. I was trying to protect the community." "Ma'am, you just admitted you couldn't actually see the area where you claimed to witness suspicious activity." "I heard noises that could have been anything. Wind animals, settling structures." Martinez closed his notepad. "Ma'am, I'm going to strongly advise you to be very certain about what you're reporting before you call emergency services." After the police left, David stood in his driveway, staring at Karen. The streetlights cast long shadows between them, and the suburban quiet felt ominous rather than peaceful. "This has to stop," he said. "What has to stop?" "The harassment. The false reports." The campaign to make my family's life miserable. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm protecting my community from people who don't belong here. People who don't belong here. We've lived here for 3 years. We pay our taxes, follow the rules, contribute to the community. What gives you the right to decide we don't belong? Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You want to know what gives me the right? I'll tell you what gives me the right. She pulled out her phone and showed David a photo. It was a picture of his nephew shooting hoops in the driveway, taken from a distance with what looked like a telephoto lens. I have hundreds of these, she said. Photos of your family going about your daily lives, your nephew playing basketball, your wife gardening, you coming home from work. David felt his blood turn to ice. You've been stalking my family. I've been documenting violations of community standards. You've been taking pictures of my wife and nephew without their consent. I've been gathering evidence for compliance enforcement. David stared at the photo. His nephew looked young and innocent, completely unaware that he was being watched and photographed. The idea of Karen lurking somewhere with a camera, documenting his family's every move, made him feel physically sick. How long have you been doing this? Since the first day you moved in, and I realized what kind of neighbors you were going to be. What kind of neighbors are we? The kind who think rules don't apply to them. The kind who lower property values. By treating residential neighborhoods like playgrounds, the kind who have children that they don't properly supervise. David felt something snap inside him. Don't you dare talk about my nephew. Your nephew who plays basketball at inappropriate hours. Your nephew who leaves equipment scattered around the driveway. Your nephew who creates noise disturbances that affect the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties. My nephew who is 12 years old and plays basketball in his own driveway. Your nephew who is a symptom of a larger problem. Families who move into established neighborhoods and immediately begin degrading the community standards that took years to build. Community standards like stalking children with cameras, community standards like maintaining property values and aesthetic integrity. David pulled out his own phone and began recording. Karen, I want you to say that again. I want you to clearly state that you've been taking photographs of my family without their consent. Karen realized what he was doing and stepped back. I'm documenting compliance violations as part of my duties as an HOA board member. You're stalking my family and taking pictures of my nephew. I'm protecting property values from people who refuse to maintain community standards. You're harassing a 12-year-old child because you don't like basketball. Karen's composure finally cracked completely. I'm trying to save this neighborhood from people like you. People who move in and immediately start treating it like some kind of suburban playground where anything goes. People like us. People who don't understand that communities require sacrifice. People who think their personal convenience is more important than everyone else's property values. People with children who they don't proper. The plan was simple, elegant, and completely dependent on Karen Whitmore being exactly as predictable as David thought she was. For 6 days, David followed a carefully choreographed routine. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he would check his mailbox, water his plants, and retrieve his newspaper wall. His security cameras recorded everything. Every evening at 6 p.m., his nephew Michael would shoot hoops in the driveway for exactly 30 minutes. The sound of the basketball echoing through the neighborhood like a dinner bell for Karen's obsessive attention. David was creating a pattern, establishing a routine that Karen could document and predict. He was giving her a target. On the morning of the election, David added one final element to his routine. He placed a campaign sign in his front yard, a simple white placard with Richardson for Architectural Review in bold blue letters. According to HOA regulations, campaign signs were permitted on Election Day only and must be removed within 24 hours of poll closure. David positioned the sign exactly 18 inches from his property line, measured to the quarter inch, photographed its placement from multiple angles, and documented the time of installation. Then he went inside and waited. The trap was set. Karen took the bait faster than he'd anticipated. At 9:47 a.m., David's security cameras captured her walking past his house, stopping to examine the campaign sign with her phone camera. At 10:15 a.m., she returned with a measuring tape, carefully documenting the sign's distance from the property line. At 10:32 a.m., she was back again, this time with her ever-present clipboard, writing what appeared to be detailed notes. At 11:08 a.m., Karen Whitmore made the mistake that would end her reign of terror. The security footage showed her approaching David's campaign sign with a pair of garden shears. She looked around nervously, then quickly cut the sign's support, stakes, and pulled it from the ground. She carried it to her car, threw it in the trunk, and drove away. David had her on camera committing theft and destruction of property, but he wasn't done yet. At 1 p.m., as planned, David called the police to report his stolen campaign sign. Officer Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, took David's statement, and reviewed the security footage. "Mr. Richardson, this is pretty clear-cut," Martinez said, watching Karen remove the sign for the third time. "Theft of campaign materials is a misdemeanor, and doing it on Election Day makes it an election crime." "I want to press charges," David said. "Are you sure? This is going to escalate things significantly. Things are already escalated. She threatened my family. She's been stalking us for months. She vandalized my car. This ends today." Martinez nodded. "We'll need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint. And Mr. Richardson, you might want to consider a restraining order." "I'm considering a lot of things, officer." At 2 p.m., while David was at the police station filing charges, Karen was at the HOA office filing her own complaint. She accused David of intimidating voters by positioning his campaign sign in a threatening manner, violating noise ordinances during the morning hours, and conducting campaign activities outside the permitted time frame. Margaret Chen, the HOA administrator, looked exhausted as she processed Karen's paperwork. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, "I have to ask, do you have any documentation of these violations?" "I have photographs, measurements, and detailed time logs," Karen replied, producing her familiar folder of evidence. "And where is Mr. Richardson's campaign sign now?" "It was removed due to improper placement." "Removed by whom?" Karen hesitated. "By concerned residents who felt it violated the aesthetic guidelines." "Mrs. Whitmore, campaign signs are explicitly permitted on Election Day. You can't remove someone's sign because you think it violates aesthetic guidelines. The sign was positioned in a way that created a public safety hazard." "Mrs. Whitmore, did you remove Mr. Richardson's campaign sign?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Karen's carefully constructed mask of civic responsibility began to crack. "I protected community property from illegal political advertising," she said finally. "You removed his sign. I enforced community standards. Without authority from the HOA board, you removed a legally placed campaign sign on Election Day." Karen's composure shattered completely. "Someone had to do something? He's been waging war against this community for months. He's turned neighbors against each other, filed frivolous complaints, and tried to destroy everything we've worked to build here. Mrs. Whitmore, you need to calm down." "I won't calm down. I've dedicated 3 years of my life to this community. And now some troublemaker thinks he can waltz in and destroy everything because his precious nephew wants to play basketball." Margaret stared at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you should go home. I'm not going home until someone does something about David Richardson. What would you like us to do? Arrest him, fine him, force him to sell his house and move somewhere? Else, on what grounds?" "On the grounds that he doesn't belong here." The words echoed through the small office. Margaret Chen had been managing HOA disputes for over a decade, but she'd never seen anything like this. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I think you need to take a step back and consider what you're saying. I'm saying that some people don't belong in neighborhoods like this. I'm saying that communities have the right to protect themselves from families who don't understand what it means to maintain standards. You're saying that the Richardson family doesn't belong in their own home because you don't like the sound of children playing. I'm saying that the Richardson family has declared war on community values. By playing basketball, by refusing to accept that their personal convenience isn't more important than everyone else's property values." Margaret made a note in her file. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to recommend that the board place you on administrative leave pending a review of your recent actions." "You can't do that. I'm an elected board member." "You're an elected board member who just admitted to removing a legally placed campaign sign because you don't think a family belongs in their own neighborhood." Karen went pale. "That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. And I have a feeling it's not the first time you've said it." At 4 p.m., while Karen was having her breakdown at the HOA office, David was meeting with his campaign team at the community center, where voting was taking place. The election was going better than expected. Turnout was high, and exit polls suggested that residents were hungry for change. Tom Henderson found David reviewing voter lists with Mrs. Patterson. "We might actually pull this off," Tom said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "Don't celebrate yet," David replied. "Karen's not going to go quietly." As if summoned by his words, the community center doors burst open, and Karen Whitmore stormed in, her face flushed with rage and her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "This election is invalid," she announced to the room full of voters. "David Richardson has been intimidating voters and violating election laws." The room fell silent. 23 residents stopped their conversations and stared at Karen, who looked like she was on the verge of a complete psychological break. "Ma'am," said the election supervisor, a patient woman named Linda Torres, "you need to keep your voice down. This is a polling place. This is a farce," Karen shouted. "Richardson has been campaigning illegally, harassing board members and filing false complaints to interfere with the democratic process." "Mrs. Whitmore," Neighbor said quietly, "I think you should go home." "I'm not going anywhere. Someone needs to tell these people the truth about what you've been doing." "What have I been doing?" "You've been waging war against this community since the day you moved in. You've turned neighbors against each other, violated HOA regulations, and used your family as weapons against anyone who tries to maintain standards." The voters in the room were staring now, their faces reflecting confusion and growing concern. Several people had their phones out, recording Karen's meltdown. "Karen," David said, his voice remaining calm, "you're having a breakdown in front of half the neighborhood? I'm having a revelation in front of half the neighborhood. I'm telling them the truth about families like yours, families like mine. Families who move into established communities and immediately start demanding special treatment because they have children." Mrs. Chen, who was in line to vote, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, what's wrong with families having children?" "Nothing's wrong with having children if you teach them to respect other people's property. What did Mr. Richardson's nephew do that was so disrespectful? He played basketball. He made noise. He treated the neighborhood like his personal playground." The room was dead silent now. Karen seemed oblivious to the fact that she was confessing 2 months of harassment in front of 24 witnesses. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Elena Parkinson, "are you saying that children shouldn't be allowed to play in their own driveways?" "I'm saying that children should be controlled. I'm saying that parents should consider the impact of their children's activities on property values." "You're saying that my son shouldn't be able to shoot hoops after school?" asked Maria Johnson. "I'm saying that your son's recreation isn't more important than everyone else's peace and quiet." "You're saying that children are the problem?" asked Mr. Nguyen. "I'm saying that families who don't control their